Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're here to talk about breaking into tech, and we will start. So, as always, I like to tell you how we'll spend our time together. So, here's our agenda for the day. I'll share a little bit more about me. I'll give you general tips for finding a job in tech, as well as the timeline. And I'll give you 4 pieces of advice that are tried and true. And you can be sure that I only give advice after I've very much lived it myself. So we'll do that. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. So feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A if you have any questions, and I'll get to them at the end of our time together. So again, hi, I'm Lida. It's great to be here and nice to meet you. So I've lived and worked all over the world, and I speak 3 languages well and working on another set of 3. I've worked mostly in marketing. In the last 11 years, I've also built products and programs for companies, both large and small. And obviously, I'm passionate about using tech to build great experiences that improve people's lives. So I'm happy to be here to share with you what I've learned personally from breaking into a tech career. I did so 6 years ago from a non-tech background, and I've also been a hiring manager for 5 years. I'm happy to talk about any of that experience if it's interesting to you. So a little bit more detail in case you're curious. I worked in academia and in government, actually, since 2006 all the way to 2009. I'm originally from Canada, but I also worked in Australia in academia and also in government in Japan. And then I moved back home to Canada. You'll notice this a few times. It's really helpful to be able to speak the language. So I always made sure to move back home in between jobs and life abroad. And so I worked at a large organization, both in Canada and in Switzerland, and then moved back home to Canada, as you can see, in 2013, so 6 years ago, to work at a fund that invested in clean tech companies specifically. And that's where I really decided to get full on into the tech space. So I founded a startup a year or so later, and then in 2016, I moved to San Francisco, where I live now. And I've been in the startup space there as well, both working and leading a team in startups, as well as consulting all over North America for the last couple of years. So US, Canada, Mexico. So that's a little bit about the background I'm bringing to this conversation, so you understand my context for the piece of advice as well. So some general tips for you for breaking into tech and getting a job that you love is to realize that it's called job hunting for a reason. So you definitely should realize that this is a time where you can definitely do your homework and your research and hunt for the job and the team that you really like. And look at this as a game, and that's the way you can actually make it more fun, because to win or to land a job, there's a few key factors. Of course, there's some other ones, but if you find that you have more time to explore these, I would really recommend it. We won't be able to have the time to go over all of these today. And the first of which is you have to know yourself. So no one, not me, not anyone else, should tell you whether you should come and work in tech. It's something that you need to decide for yourself and make sure that you really enjoy working with startups, working in a fast-paced environment, because it's not for everybody. So if you do love it, then I do recommend it. And in that case, you definitely should realize that you need to know the tech stack. If you're working in a technical role, you need to know the business and the market as well. So if you're going in and applying to jobs at a company that just finished its funding round and has already hired everybody and doesn't have any more money to hire people, that's something that you should be conscientious of, because in the tech space, there's very it's very important to know when a startup actually has raised a round so that they would be more likely to hire. We'll get into a lot of tips like that soon. Obviously, you ideally have to have the right timing, and you should definitely connect with people while you're doing this. It's very rare that someone will apply to a job and get that first job that they want right away, and they won't expect any rejection. Most people have some jobs that they apply to and that they don't get, and the best way to mitigate that is to connect with people to make it not such a lonely journey. So sometimes you might feel like this. You're very close to a job, you're very close to getting that offer, and then something unexpected happens. So that's why you should realize that having support really does help. So let's get into the timeline. And I'll warn you that this upcoming slide is very wordy, and that's on purpose because the timeline tends to be quite long for some people. So the first thing that I call hunting season is when you should definitely do your research. Do your best to find out what type of company you want to work for and what type of role you want to do there. And the more time you spend in getting clear on this research, the less time you'll spend doing the rest of this. Because I can tell you as a hiring manager, anytime I got an application and went on the phone interview, I could tell if that person didn't know what we did or didn't know very well why they wanted that role. So they didn't advance to the next step. So the best way that you can make sure you set yourself up for success in this process is to really get the job hunt part down with knowing what kinds of roles you do want and you don't want, the size of team that you're looking to work at, size of company you're looking to work at, so that you save everybody time in the process. Another thing to realize with this is that it is a two-way process. So if you get an offer, that doesn't mean that you should take it. If you get to the end of this timeline and you find a better fit elsewhere, you can very well be in a position to say no to an offer, and realize that you do have a lot of leverage as a candidate. It might not feel like that, but you should realize that this is a two-way street and you are qualifying the employer as much as they are qualifying you. So let's assume you get that first phone interview. Great, this is the initial screen that usually the recruiter and usually the hiring manager will do to make sure that you have the qualifications that they're looking for, and to do this process quickly so that they can pass some people on to the next step and some others not. So then if you make it to the next step, it's almost always an in-person interview. And this is really where you can make a great impression. So at this point, the company has already invested time in going over your resume, your application, your tests, if you had to do any to get there, your phone interview. So by this point, they've already invested some time in you. So definitely use the in-person interviews to make an impression and do your best to shine, because they tend to be the most important part of the timeline. Almost always, at least for the roles I've always had to do a take-home assignment, a final assignment, and that's to evaluate the depth of your skills. This is not always the case, so you may not have to do this. Maybe if you're in design or you're a developer, you've already done your assignment portion of the timeline earlier on, but in other roles, you tend to get this at the end. And then last but not least, I've heard that people also get trial days, or what's called contract to hire, where teams can assess whether you're a great cultural add and whether they want to work with you full time. And this is because a lot of these companies are very small, so you can assume that they are taking a risk with every hire that they do. So having this option for them is a possibility. You should always get paid for the trial days or contract to hire. So realize that if that's being asked of you, you always should be demanding working wage for that. Obviously, this is a lot. The job search timeline can seem long and arduous. So definitely being in a group and having some support helps. And we'll get into that later in the presentation. So now some advice I have for you as you're doing your job hunt to land your perfect role in tech. First of which, easier said than done, but be resilient. Realize that there's a lot of factors that are actually outside of your control. You don't know, maybe this company is actually experiencing a hiring freeze, or there's something happening with top level management that you're not privy to. So don't take things personally, even if you get rejected and it's towards the end of the process. Regardless, you can always ask for feedback. I can tell you that every time someone asked for feedback and I was a hiring manager, I went back to the rubric that I use. I put together personalized feedback for them and I emailed it back to them or hopped on the phone and told them the feedback I had. So I can guarantee you, if you don't ask, the chance is 100% that you're not going to get feedback, because it is a lot of time for the hiring manager to put this feedback together. Having said that, if you do ask for feedback, folks like me will take the time to reply to you. Also, another fact is to focus on your strengths and what went well. I know it can seem very challenging at times when you're doing the job hunt, but the best thing you can do is actually focus on what went well in the process, and rather than what didn't, because the best definition I have for you of being resilient is using what you think are your weaknesses to your strengths. So if you went through a very challenging experience with a job interview or even making a transition, then you can actually see that you're very strong and you're able to surpass that. So that's what being resilient is all about. Another very important factor for me as a lifelong learner is to always be learning. A lot of people tell me, oh wow, Lida, you have your finger on the pulse. So you definitely know what's going on in the marketing world in San Francisco, or you know a lot of people. And I can tell you it's by design and it just doesn't happen by accident. So a practical tip I have for you is to find inspiration from your peers. So I definitely take time to subscribe to newsletters of fellow marketers. I know designers follow each other on Dribbble. Developers perhaps look at each other's GitHub repositories. So realize that you can make a lot of great connections, both in person and online. And a lot of times, this is what leads to innovation, when you're able to connect disparate pieces of information and then actually use that to lead to more open doors for you. So realize that learning can be free and that you should be persistent with it. So like this monkey here to break up our text between the slides. Be persistent with your learning. If you can do more, definitely do more. This is really important, and this is something I highlight due to a lot of experience with people asking for advice and also for recruiting people. Communication is key in building relationships. So if you're connecting with someone like me, or let's say just anybody online, and you're asking for to pick their brain or to essentially have an informational interview, make sure that there's something beneficial there for them as well, that you're going to share maybe an article that you learned something about. Maybe you have past experience that you want to share that would be useful for me. So I noticed that some people are very much in take mode when they want to take information, and that's not a good way to build relationships. It's a give and take. So if you're asking someone for a favor, definitely put yourself in their shoes. So I know that people sometimes email their recruiter and they're very frustrated when the recruiter doesn't respond right away. I can tell you that recruiters have usually 10 roles, or at least several, that they're recruiting for at a certain period of time, and they probably have hundreds of applications to go through. So just put yourself in their shoes. Like, sometimes it's not the greatest response time, I understand. Feel free to follow up, but just be patient as well. And for the hiring managers, definitely feel free to connect with them. When you have interviews with them, you can look people's names up on LinkedIn and find out more about them. But also, again, try to make their life easier. So do your best to make this a win-win situation for both sides. Having said that, since most of you are looking for jobs in the tech sector, this is something that I realized as a humble Canadian moving to the San Francisco Bay Area. You definitely need to know how to sell yourself and your experience. There's very little there if you don't share what you've done well. So anything which is a good achievement, make sure you highlight it in your resume and your cover letter, because this leads to referrals possibly and more open doors. And one last thing I'll say about this, and I would say this is one of the most important things throughout this presentation, so take note of this. If there's any way you can get a referral for a job and have the person submit the application on your behalf, I highly recommend it, because it's a numbers game. And for every job that I was recruiting for at a company, I would get over 100 applications. So it's a lot easier for someone to stand out when they are referred. Life is unfair, as we all know. So if you have a chance to get a referral and stand out from the entire pile of applications that I would have to go through as a hiring manager, then I would recommend it. I definitely took the time to give everyone a chance. So anyone who was qualified, I gave them a chance to do a phone interview, but then that meant I had to do over 20 phone interviews with people. I don't anticipate that every hiring manager does this. So take your time to make connections. And if you can get a referral, then do so, because there's usually something in it for the other person as well. And also, since we're talking about connections and groups, join a support group if that's of interest to you. I've run a couple of these now in the Bay Area, and this is the first time we're expanding it to anybody remotely as well. So you don't have to be in San Francisco to join. And we've had really great success and true community for people breaking into the tech industry or even advancing in their careers. So the first two groups were focused on women in tech. So after this 5-week program, we had women who started roles at Apple, Internet Brands, and Silicon Valley Bank, literally immediately after finishing the 5-week program. So there's more information on this link, PIDAAR.com, which means resilient in Persian. So as you can tell, resilience is a big passion area of mine. And also feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. If you have any extenuating circumstances, we do have a couple of scholarships available, but we only have a couple of spots left. So here's a little more information. We will meet on Zoom every week, so you're all on Zoom, which means that you've already figured out how to do it. There's an option to meet in person for social events if you're local. So if there's a cluster of people in the Bay Area, we can meet. Otherwise, that's okay. In addition to practical tips on breaking into tech, so essentially a multiple fold of information that I gave you today, we'll also cover other topics, because the job hunt process isn't just looking on job boards and applying. It's a very important holistic approach that we take, which includes mindfulness, how you define success in a future role, how you're measuring happiness, actually, your relationship to rejection or failure, and also, very importantly, how you can leverage network, mentorship, and coaching in your process. So we have 4 coaches, and everyone gets one-on-one sessions in this process. And again, for the job hunter, we've had really great success so far with the first couple of programs we've run. Again, I'm happy to discuss options for scholarships for people who have extenuating circumstances, and feel free to get in touch with me if that's a fit. So last but not least, piece of advice, know your impact. This is really important. So learn the key value of the business. Even if you're not in sales or marketing, it's really important that you know what relevant key performance indicators you're going to be measured on in this new role. Even if you're a developer, a product manager, it's really important, because there's just fewer people who tend to work in startups on a given project. So it's really important to all have the same KPIs that you're going for. And I can almost guarantee you that the most senior person on any interview panel is directly or indirectly going to ask you questions about impact, KPIs. So make sure you're always contributing value in those conversations. So for instance, when you have the meeting with that senior person, they might ask you what you hope to achieve in the first 30, 60, or 90 days. That's basically what your impact would be. So essentially get ahead of them and figure out when you get to that far stage of the program, of the job hunt, when you're in your final in-person interviews, you definitely should know what success looks like for the first quarter of any job you're going into. And that way you can really ace your interview with that most senior person, because they almost always have veto power. So if you impress them, that's good. If you don't impress them, that could mean that your interview process stops there. So make sure, this is something I've learned from experience. I interviewed for a role where I met 12 people. The most important person I had only a half-hour conversation with. She's the COO of this, like 500-person company. And I can guarantee you that she's the reason why I ended up getting the job, in the sense that if I hadn't aced that interview, I wouldn't have. So make sure you know your impact and what you're bringing to the job. And very importantly, grab that role in tech. I wish you all the best with this. I know it can feel like a lonesome journey at times, but you're definitely not alone. And when you do find that role that fits for you, you will experience sweet success. So I'm happy to keep in touch. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and or Twitter. You can easily find me with my first and last name. You can, again, go on this website, pidaar.com, if you would like the slides, and or if you would like to apply for the program. All the information is there. So feel free to connect with me and find out more information. So